Palisade Radio, and I'm your host, Colin Cattell. Back on the program with us today is Doug Casey, the New York Times best-selling author and famed speculator. Doug is also a neighbor of mine at La Estancia de Cafayate in Argentina, and for any of our listeners who have not made it down to La Estancia yet, the yearly springtime celebration is coming up on October 28th. Just visit laest.com for more information. Doug, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Colin. Thank you.
Over the years, you've participated in thousands of interviews, and throughout that time, you've remained very consistent in your convictions about economics, government, and the liberty movement. Today, I'd like to try and ask you some questions that maybe have not been asked before to give our listeners a fresh perspective. And my first question pertains to your development into an extreme believer in the libertarian movement. Alex Jones, who just spoke at the Casey conference in San Antonio, often says, quote, "The mainstream has marginalized me and turned me into an extremist. Yet certainly others have shared similar life experiences to yourself, but veered off into the realm of statism. I know you've theorized that libertarianism could be partially genetic, which is not far-fetched. Can you identify the moment that the switch flicked in your head and Doug Casey became Doug Casey?"
Yeah, that's a very good question because I think back to my early childhood and the way I thought. And my first kind of political awakening probably occurred when I was 6 years old. And I'd gone through the slums of Chicago with my mother. And it was full of black people living in dumpy old buildings. And I asked her, I said, why don't they do something about this? And idiotically, I wrote a letter to President Eisenhower, who my mother was good enough to type for me, asking him to do something. So I guess when I was 6 years old, I thought like a typical liberal. Perhaps I was good-hearted but stupid. I mean, how much does a 6-year-old know? About as much as your typical liberal does today. And I evolved from there to becoming a Goldwater conservative that made sense. And then I became an objectivist after I read Ayn Rand. That lasted for about a year because it's actually kind of a religion. But early on, even as I went to grade school, I didn't like people telling me what to do. And that's one thing that makes me conclude that it's really a genetic condition more than anything else. On the other hand, I believe in Pareto's law, the 80-20 rule. And my interpretation of it is that 80% of people are basically decent. But you take 20% of that 80% and 20% of that and so forth, and you become more and more, if you want to use the word extreme, but I would simply say fully observant of the logical consequences of an ethical position. So I don't know what the answer to that question is. Is being a libertarian something that's inborn or something that you learn? And I'm still on the wire about it. Having a basically positive view of most people, I'd like to think that exposed to the thought process, that their eyes would open and they say, yeah, I like to be left alone and I like to leave other people alone and not tell other people what to do and be a person of goodwill. But I'm not sure anybody's come up with a definitive answer, and that would include myself. So I'm not sure if that's a good answer, but that's probably the best one I can give you off the top of my head.
You're a believer in the Austrian school, which claims that boom-bust cycles are the direct result of the government's meddling into the economy. By pumping in liquidity and then removing it, capital is misallocated and we experience these tremendous swings in asset prices. But what I want to ask you is, absent government intervention in the economy, would there still be boom-bust cycles due to investor psychology? Certainly it would be far less, but does the herd mentality and the flaws in human rationale also play a role in the boom bust cycle, and to what degree?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. It's the herd instinct, and it's hard to say what might actuate that at any given time, where people see something happens and they all want to get involved in it. And uh, I think bubbles can be created as a matter of psychology, but when that happens, I think they tend to be not too serious and they tend to be localized. The problem is that when you have an unsound banking system, a fractional reserve system, there's a lot of free money around that makes it possible for these bubbles to get much, much bigger. So it seems to me that the most important single thing that could be done. There's so many problems in today's economy, but if I was going to put my finger on one single thing, it would be the elimination of the fractional reserve system, where as in classical times, even up to the 19th century, uh, anybody could open a bank, and you basically had two types of bank accounts: a checking account, demand deposit type account, where people paid you to store their money and give them the right to write checks against it, and a savings account type deposit, or a time deposit where the bank pays you to put your money there and lends it out. Let's say it pays you 3, lends it out at 6, takes the 3% to cover its risk and to make a profit. And that's the way the banking system used to be run, and times were much more stable then. So I really lay most of the problems that we have in the economy today, and by most I mean like 95%, at the foot of the government. And the remaining problems are due to psychological aberrations, which are generally small and local, and fraud, which I'm afraid that you can't rule out when you're dealing with the human animal.
Doug, my life experience is pale in comparison to yours. I've traveled to far fewer countries, lived in just three, but whenever I travel abroad, I can't help but coming back to one thought, and that is no matter how nice or free another country is, at this very moment in time, the United States of America may still be the best country in the world. The trend is downward, but in terms of quality of life, where else can you find the convenience of Walmart on every corner, an abundance of places to live with low crime, well kept public areas, a reasonably friendly business climate, and a well educated populace? My question to you is, do you believe that the United States is still the best country in the world at this moment?
Uh, yeah, that's something I've thought about a little bit. It used to be when I was, let's say, in high school, the U.S. was totally unique. There was no place like it. Well, Canada was a little bit like it. Canada was 20 years behind the times, and you went to Australia, it was 30 years behind the times, but they were similar to the U.S. But other than Canada, Australia, New Zealand, uh, the U.S. really was unique 50 years ago. Now, so many countries have advanced more rapidly than the U.S. in this time. They've closed the gap. But from the point of view, from the point of view of a standard of living for the average person, as you know, you go to most countries in the world, you have really most of the conveniences in South America, Europe, Asia that you do in the U.S. So that from a standard of living point of view, there's no longer much difference between the U.S. and the rest of the world, which there used to be in those days. Uh, and from a personal freedom point of view, I'd say that you're actually freer in a lot of countries around the world, if only because if you're a foreigner living in those countries, the local government doesn't treat you as its possession. You're the possession of the U.S. government, and it's kind of a professional courtesy that's given to you. You're a foreign ghost who can come and go at will, a tourist to be courted, as opposed to a citizen, which governments view as a milk cow to be taken advantage of. But unfortunately, the trend all over the world is negative from a personal freedom point of view. All over the world, these governments have become more powerful, taking more in tax revenues, taking advantage of technological breakthroughs to monitor citizens and control them more. So at this point, where really can you go to maximize your personal liberty? And there really is no place. The answer is that you have to live in a place where you're not a citizen and not a taxpayer, which means to maximize your personal freedom, you're going to have to wind up spending time in 2 or even 3 countries per year so that you never really get caught in their nets. And the downtrend in the U.S. is really accelerating, and it's very, very disturbing at this point. And I don't see what's going to turn it around. So the short-term prognosis for freedom is not good anywhere. However, the long term, I think, after we go through this coming crisis, it may look up. But I speak as a perpetual optimist.
Back in March, we were sitting in your house in Cafajate, and you were reminiscing on the days of the epic gold bull market of the late 70s and 80s. And during that discussion, you recalled month-long stretches when your stocks were rising 5, 10, or 15% per day across your entire portfolio. Even if this is to happen again, investors will almost certainly have to wait a few years from now until a bull market is in the latter stages. Is that the case, or what do you see in terms of how the gains will unfold?
Yeah, it's very interesting because when I first got into this business back in the early 70s, in those days, the main attractant for capital in the mining industry were the South African gold stocks. And up until 1971, of course, the South African gold stocks, which were historically big dividend payers, 5, 10, 15% were typical dividend yields back in the late 60s, and even up to the early 70s for the South African gold stocks. And that was with gold at $35 an ounce. So here you have these mines that were a mile or 2 miles under the ground that were making money at $35 an ounce gold. So today, depending on how you count costs, whether pure cash or replenishing of capital, there's so many ways of computing costs today. But we're talking, forget about making money in those deep South African mines at $35. Now, any place in the world, you need $600, $800, $1,000, $1,200 gold just to break even. The mining business has changed tremendously in the last couple of generations. Now, mining has always been a crappy business for lots of reasons, but it's gotten worse. Maybe it's because all the low-hanging fruit has been picked over the last couple of generations, aided by high technology and such. Maybe it's because governments have become more grasping than they have ever been in the past. Maybe it's because environmental regulations and labor problems have tremendously raised the costs of mining in addition to these things. So speaking to why the mining business isn't as attractive as it was in the past when these stocks would move as a group 1,000 to 1 during bull markets. Maybe that's part of it. Um, but the good thing about the business is that it's cyclical. And 2/3 of the companies listed in Vancouver that say they're mining companies are bankrupt as we speak. They're zombies. We're just waiting for them to be delisted. And the world is always going to need raw materials. It's going to need copper and gold and nickel and so forth. So these things are going to have to be found because they're depleting assets. They're being mined. We're going to have to find more of them. So even though mining has always been a tough business, and it's a much tougher business than in the past, I'm optimistic that we're going to see another bull market, and it's better than that, Colin, because with the governments of the world creating trillions of dollars per year in new currency on a worldwide basis as we speak, it's going to create more bubbles. And I think one of those bubbles is going to be in gold, and chances are excellent we're going to get a super bubble in these crappy little mining stocks. So it's always darkest before the dawn, and I think this is the time to buy them. Hope those aren't famous last words, but that's the way I see it.
Being a speculator in the junior mining space for the past 4 years has taught me a lesson that I'm sure you learned years ago, and that is you can have the right theories, you can understand what the future is likely to hold, but you cannot predict how long things will go against you. Take the US dollar as an example. I understand this was a main topic at your recent event in San Antonio. Despite the fact that the US dollar is not viable long term and it's currently being inflated through monetary easing, it's been soaring the past few weeks, and of course, this has been sending gold down even further. Just general comments on this?
Well, you know that old saying, it's supposed to have been originated by John Maynard Keynes, which is the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. And that's true. But all over the world, commerce is conducted with paper money. There is no sound money anywhere in the world today. And since the US dollar is most widely dispersed around the world, it's the most convenient thing to use. And most people, having been inculcated with incorrect economic ideas, they rely on the dollar. So that's the explanation for why it's done. Is even though it's losing ground in absolute terms, it's still able to gain ground relative to other currencies. Um, Even commodities at the moment, it's almost a paradox, actually. But as far as the long-term future of the dollar, they're continuing to print up hundreds of billions of new ones per year. Still, most of those dollars are being exported. I don't know how many U.S. dollars are outside the U.S., but there are 8, 10 billion, 12 trillion, dollars, and foreigners don't have to hold on to those dollars, don't have to use them the way Americans do. At some point, there could be a real panic where all the foreigners that own those offshore dollars want to dump them, at which point they'll all come back to the U.S. In exchange for real wealth. Inflation will explode domestically in the U.S. It could be a real panic situation, and it could happen anytime. So the fundamentals haven't changed, even though at the moment, as you pointed out, the dollar is relatively strong. So I haven't changed any of my views on these things. The strength of the dollar, incidentally, is in some ways resulted in a twilight zone where everything in the world is actually expensive. There are very few bargains in the world today because you have all this paper money looking for a place to land, and it's driven up the cost of or the price, I should say, of almost anything and everything. There's very few bargains in the world today. It's almost like a metaphysical impossibility that nothing is cheap. So I'll be very interested in seeing how this all comes unglued in the next few years. But I'm pretty confident that as we speak at the end of 2014, we're pretty close to the edge of the precipice at this point.
Doug, I really appreciate your time as always. Thanks so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, Colin, and thanks for asking a few questions that most people have not asked me.